The sunlight filtered through the blinds of the Cleveland bank where Theodore Conrad worked as a teller. His desk was cluttered with stacks of crisp bills, withdrawal slips and pens on the verge of drying out. Every movement in the bank was rehearsed, robotic. The click of the cash drawer, the shuffle of papers, the polite but disinterested nods from customers. Theodore's routine was as predictable as the seasons, and it weighed on him. Sitting behind the counter, he watched his colleagues move with the same lifeless energy. The manager barked out reminders about balancing accounts. The security guards exchanged dull pleasantries, and the customers shuffled in and out, their eyes glued to their watches. Theodore's mind, however, was never in the moment. Instead, he dreamed of something more, something far beyond Cleveland's gray skies and the suffocating repetition of his days. He often found himself staring at the stacks of cash in the vault, his thoughts wandering. It wasn't greed that fueled him, but curiosity. How much money was enough to change a life? What would it take to step out of this monotonous world and into something extraordinary? Friday evenings were Theodore's refuge. He'd walk to a small downtown theater and escape from the monotony. On one particular evening, he bought a ticket for the Thomas Crown affair. He had heard the film was about a charming man who orchestrated an art heist just for the thrill of it. The idea intrigued him, though he hadn't expected it to leave such a mark. As the lights dimmed, Theodore leaned back in his seat, letting the film transport him. Scene after scene, he watched the protagonist outsmart the authorities with effortless charisma, his every move calculated and precise. There was no desperation in the man's actions, no need for money. It was a game, a demonstration of control and intellect. When the credits rolled, Theodore sat motionless in the dim theater, his pulse quickened, his mind buzzing with possibilities. If he could outsmart a world that underestimated him, wouldn't that prove something? The idea wasn't born of recklessness or despair, but a deep desire to prove something, to himself and to a world that had never noticed him. That night, Theodore's apartment transformed into a workshop for his thoughts. On his small wooden desk, he opened a notebook and began scribbling. His first notes were scattered, fragmented thoughts. He noticed how the manager always checked the vault at exactly 3 p.m. every day, and often left it unlocked during the busiest hours, trusting the rush to deter any mischief. He realized that the security cameras had a significant blind spot near the third counter, where they overlapped and left a small section of the floor unmonitored. Fridays became his favorite day to observe because the staff was stretched thin, with only essential personnel working the shifts. As the days passed, those chaotic scribbles evolved into something more structured. Theodore began piecing together a plan. He would exploit the bank's routines and blind spots, using his insider knowledge to execute what he believed would be a flawless operation. He envisioned every detail, the timing, the escape, even how to carry the cash without raising suspicion. He practiced folding the bills and placing them in an unassuming bag, rehearsing the movements until they felt second nature. Every new observation at work became another piece of the puzzle. He noticed how the manager often left the vault unlocked during busy hours, trusting that no one would dare attempt anything in broad daylight. He noted how the guards grew complacent during lunch breaks, their eyes more focused on their sandwiches than the security monitors. Theodore lay motionless on his bed, the thin blanket barely covering him as the chill of the night seeped through the cracks in the window. The faint hum of a passing car broke the silence every now and then, but it only deepened the void he felt. Above him, the cracks in the ceiling formed patterns he had memorized, like the lines of a map he couldn't escape. The weight of his plan pressed down on him, heavier than any of the cash bundles he handled daily at the bank. He turned over the risks in his mind, each one darker than the last. What if he slipped up? What if the cameras caught him or the guards noticed something off? What if someone saw through his calm exterior and raised an alarm? He imagined the headlines splashed across the morning papers. Bank teller arrested in brazen heist. The thought sent a chill through him. He could see the disappointment in his parents' faces, their trust shattered. He thought of his friends, the ones who'd laugh behind his back and call him a fool for even trying. Theodore clenched his fists, trying to shake off the images, But the more he tried, the clearer they became. The cold iron bars of a prison cell, the suffocating silence of regret, the life he would never live. Yet, as terrifying as failure seemed, something else loomed even larger. A life left untouched, unchanged. He imagined himself 10 years down the line, still sitting at that desk in the bank, counting other people's money. The thought made his stomach churn. What scared him most wasn't prison or disgrace. It was the idea of becoming invisible, of fading into the background, another nameless face in a sea of mediocrity. He could already feel it happening. Day by day, his dreams were eroding, worn down by the monotony of Cleveland, the suffocating predictability of his job, and the knowledge that no one expected anything extraordinary from him. Is this it? He thought, his breath hitching. Is this all my life will ever be? The question echoed in his mind, louder than the hum of the city outside, louder than the ticking of the clock on his bedside table. Theodore sat up abruptly, his heart racing as if jolted by an unseen force. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his breathing. His apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in as his thoughts grew louder. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the empty street below. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the faint glow of a neon sign flickered in the distance. He thought of the life he had imagined as a child. Adventure, freedom, something bigger than this. He realized then that the risk of failure, as paralyzing as it was, wasn't what truly held him back. It was his fear of never trying. "This isn't about money," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the creak of the floorboards as he shifted his weight. "This is about control, about proving I'm more than just a teller." The words tasted foreign on his tongue, but they felt true. He repeated them, louder this time, as if saying them would make them real. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Theodore felt a strange calm settle over him. The chaos in his mind had quieted, replaced by a sense of clarity. He walked back to his bed, sitting on the edge as he stared at the notebook where his plan was beginning to take shape. It wasn't just a heist anymore. It was a declaration, a way to take back the reins of his life. He didn't want to live as a footnote in someone else's story. He wanted to write his own. Theodore picked up the notebook and flipped through the pages, his scribbled notes and diagrams suddenly looking sharper, more purposeful. He wasn't just plotting a crime, he was engineering his freedom. By the time the sun was fully up, Theodore had made his choice. The fear of staying outweighed the fear of failing. The risks were real, but so was the possibility of something better. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Theodore sat at his small desk, the dim light of his bedside lamp illuminating the notebook in front of him. The first pages were a mess of scribbles, ideas that spilled out faster than he could organize them. Words and numbers ran together, arrows pointed in every direction, and rough sketches of the bank's layout filled the margins. He tapped his pen against the notebook, staring at the blank space on the next page. It wasn't enough to have a vague idea. He needed precision. He began listing the essentials. Timing. When was the bank busiest? When was it quietest? Access. How could he get to the vault without raising suspicion? Escape. What route would get him out the fastest and farthest? Each question demanded an answer. Theodore flipped back to earlier pages where he had sketched the bank's interior. His memory served him well. He knew the placement of every camera, the path to the vault, even the quirks of his co-workers. Every day at the bank was the same. Theodore realized that routine could be his greatest asset. The managers rarely stayed on the floor for long, preferring the comfort of their offices. The guards rotated shifts in predictable patterns, and most were more interested in chatting with each other than paying attention to the tellers. The cameras were plentiful, but they covered common areas like the lobby and entrances, not the vault itself. Then there were his co-workers. Janice, the older teller, always took her lunch break at exactly 12:15. Mike, the floor supervisor, often stepped outside to smoke around 2 p.m. These little details, unnoticed by others, were pieces of a puzzle Theodore was slowly putting together. The vault was, of course, the biggest obstacle. Its thick steel door required 2 layers of access, a key card and a combination. Theodore didn't have either. Yet. But he did have proximity. He worked within feet of the people who controlled the bank's security every day. He watched as the manager, Mr. Carver, casually keyed in the vault combination without shielding it from view. He noticed how the assistant manager, Cheryl, often left her keycard on her desk when she stepped away to answer calls. The more Theodore observed, the more he realized how careless people could be. For all their procedures and protocols, the staff treated security as an afterthought. Theodore's plan required more than observation. He needed tools, and he needed to acquire them discreetly. One evening, he walked into a hardware store, keeping his purchases simple. A small lockpicking set, gloves, and a sturdy backpack. At another store across town, he picked up a burner phone and a cheap pair of sunglasses. "These are just backups," he told himself as he handed over cash. "It's not like I'll need them." But deep down, he knew he was preparing for every possibility. Theodore sat at his teller station, carefully counting out bills for a customer. On the surface, he appeared calm, professional, detached even. But inside, a storm was brewing. Today was the day he would push the boundaries. His observations, his plans, all of it had led to this moment. He needed to see just how far he could go without anyone noticing. It was mid-afternoon, the lull between the lunch rush and the after-work crowd. The air in the bank was still, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards. Cheryl, the assistant manager, had just left her desk to grab a coffee. Her workspace was like a treasure trove, papers neatly stacked, a small family photo tucked into the corner, and most importantly, her keycard sitting carelessly on the edge of her desk. Theodore's pulse quickened as he glanced around. Janice was chatting with a customer about her weekend plans, and Mike, the floor supervisor, was scrolling through his phone near the entrance. No one was paying attention to him. He stood up, a stack of papers in hand, pretending to be on his way to the copier. Each step toward Cheryl's desk felt heavier than the last. The keycard glinted faintly under the fluorescent light, taunting him with its simplicity. All he had to do was reach out. As he passed the desk, his hand brushed the edge, his fingers closing around the card in one smooth motion. He didn't stop, didn't falter, his expression betraying nothing. The keycard slid into his pocket as naturally as if it belonged there. Theodore ducked into the break room, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath to steady himself. From his pocket he pulled the keycard, holding it in his hand like a prize. It was a simple plastic card, but in his eyes, it was so much more. A symbol of how easily trust could be broken, of how much power he could wield with just a single act of defiance. He turned it over in his hands, running his thumb along the embossed numbers and magnetic strip. This is it, he thought. The first step. The card felt heavier than it should have, not in weight but in meaning. It wasn't just a tool. It was proof that he could do this. After a few minutes, he slipped the card back into his pocket. The hardest part was yet to come. He had to return it without anyone noticing. Straightening his tie, he stepped out of the break room and headed back to Cheryl's desk. The journey felt twice as long this time, every glance from a coworker feeling like it lingered just a second too long. When he reached Cheryl's desk, he paused as if adjusting his papers. With a quick, practiced motion, he returned the card to its original spot, the slight weight on the desk now gone from his pocket. No one had seen him. No one had noticed. By the end of the week, Theodore felt a new sense of clarity. The initial rush of adrenaline from taking and returning the keycard had settled into something steadier. Confidence. The success of that single act had silenced the doubts that had plagued him for weeks. He wasn't just dreaming anymore. He was acting. His notebook, once filled with chaotic sketches and ideas, now resembled a blueprint. Each detail of the plan had been refined, each step carefully calculated. He knew the timing of Cheryl's coffee breaks, the exact angle of the cameras, and the gaps in the guards' rotations. Every detail fit together like pieces of a puzzle. This isn't just a plan, Theodore thought one night as he flipped through his notes. This is my way out. The thought brought a small, grim smile to his face. He wasn't just a teller anymore. He was an architect, meticulously designing his escape from the mundane life that had trapped him for so long. Late one evening, Theodore sat alone in his apartment, staring at the keycard he had sketched into his notebook. The small, unassuming rectangle now felt like the most important piece of his plan. He had tested the waters, and the results had emboldened him. But even as confidence grew, a shadow of doubt lingered. He could still feel the weight of the card in his pocket, the seconds that had stretched into an eternity as he walked past Cheryl's desk. What if someone had noticed? What if Cheryl had returned just a second too soon? The risks were real, and they were terrifying, but they were also exhilarating. For the first time in years, Theodore felt alive. Theodore sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, a single desk lamp casting shadows over the open notebook in front of him. Every inch of the pages was covered in his meticulous handwriting, diagrams, and sketches of the bank. It was a collection of secrets he had pieced together over months of careful observation. He had watched every movement, memorized every schedule, and identified every flaw in the bank's operations. The bank wasn't just a building to Theodore anymore. It was a machine, and like every machine, it had weak points. The back door where deliveries came in wasn't reinforced. The cameras in the main hall had blind spots near the teller counters. The vault door, though intimidating, had a key system Theodore was sure he could manipulate if given enough time. Even the people were predictable. The security guard, Frank, was more interested in chatting with the tellers than watching the cameras. Cheryl, his co-worker, was distracted easily, often leaving her desk to grab coffee or make a phone call. The manager, a man named Greg, rarely checked the vault during the day, trusting his team to handle the cash flow. Theodore's notebook was his map to freedom. Every detail was a step closer to his escape, and every observation gave him the confidence that his plan would work. Unlike the elaborate heists he had seen in movies, Theodore's plan didn't require explosives or high-tech gadgets. Instead, he relied on simplicity and efficiency. He listed everything he would need: a small duffel bag to carry the money, gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and a carefully chosen outfit to blend in with the bank's staff. He even bought a fake deposit slip, an innocent-looking piece of paper that would be his key to the vault. The duffel bag was particularly important. It had to be sturdy but not suspicious, large enough to hold the cash but small enough to pass as ordinary. He spent hours searching for the right one, finally settling on a black gym bag he bought at a thrift store. When the items were gathered, Theodore practiced packing and unpacking the bag, timing himself with a stopwatch. He rehearsed every movement until it felt natural. Each item had its place and every second counted. If he wasted even a moment fumbling, the plan could unravel. His apartment became a makeshift training ground. He practiced putting on and removing gloves quickly, using the stopwatch to measure his speed. He rehearsed walking casually with the bag, imagining the weight of the cash inside. Every movement had to be perfect, smooth, precise, and unremarkable. Theodore knew he couldn't leave anything to chance, so he planned a test run to simulate the real heist. It was a Thursday afternoon, one of the quieter days at the bank. The timing had to be precise. He wanted to mimic the exact conditions of the actual day. He arrived at the bank carrying his duffel bag, which was filled with random items to mimic the weight of money. As he stepped inside, he greeted Frank, the security guard, with a nod and a smile. "Morning, Frank," he said, his voice calm and confident. Frank barely glanced at him, distracted by a newspaper on his desk. Theodore moved through the bank as if it were a normal workday. He walked to his station, pretending to review paperwork, all the while watching the clock. At exactly 11:15 a.m., he made his way to the vault area. Cheryl had just left to take her coffee break, and the vault was momentarily unguarded. He approached the vault door, standing in the same spot he would during the actual heist. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He timed himself as he went through the motions, pretending to place the fake deposit slip into the system and imagining the vault opening. The entire process took just under 15 minutes. No one questioned him, no alarms sounded, and he walked out of the bank with the duffel bag slung casually over his shoulder. The test was a success, and Theodore felt a surge of confidence. I can do this, he thought as he walked to his car. With the test run behind him, Theodore turned his attention to refining the final details of his plan. He couldn't afford any mistakes, so he scrutinized every aspect of his strategy. The exit strategy was one of the most important elements. He couldn't simply vanish after the heist. That would draw too much attention. Instead, he planned to go home as usual, following his regular routine to avoid suspicion. From there, he would store the cash in a secure location before slowly withdrawing and using it over time. Theodore scouted locations for weeks before settling on a small storage locker in a neighboring town. He rented it under a fake name, using cash to avoid leaving a paper trail. The storage unit was inconspicuous, one of dozens in a plain beige facility. It was perfect, a place where the money could sit safely until he was ready to use it. He also focused on changing his appearance. After the heist, he would dye his hair, grow a beard, and wear glasses to alter his look. He practiced different ways of walking and speaking, trying to transform himself into someone unrecognizable. It wasn't just about escaping the scene. It was about disappearing completely. Late one night, Theodore sat in his apartment staring at his notebook. For the first time, the weight of his plan felt overwhelming. The diagrams and schedules that had once filled him with confidence now seemed fragile, like a house of cards waiting to collapse. What if I missed something? He thought. What if someone sees me? What if the cameras are working or Frank suddenly decides to do his job for once? His mind spiraled into worst-case scenarios, being tackled by security, dragged away in handcuffs, his face on the evening news. He stood up and paced the room, trying to shake off the fear. I've come too far to back out now, he whispered to himself. This isn't just about money, it's about freedom, about proving that I'm more than just a teller. Theodore sat back down, taking a deep breath. He closed his notebook and stared out the window at the city lights. The fear was still there, but so was the resolve. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to let doubt stop him. This is my only chance, he thought, and I'm not going to waste it. The morning of the heist began like any other. Theodore dressed carefully, his hands steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He chose a dark suit and tie, the same kind he wore every day to the bank. Nothing about his appearance could seem out of the ordinary. He tucked the duffel bag, empty for now, into the trunk of his car and drove to work. As he navigated the streets of Cleveland, the city seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Theodore's own breathing was measured and calm. Every step of this day had been planned, rehearsed, and ingrained in his mind. There was no room for mistakes, no space for hesitation. When he arrived at the bank, he greeted Frank at the security desk with a casual, "Morning, Frank. Ready for another slow day?" Frank laughed, waving him through without a second glance. Theodore smiled, though inside his nerves tightened. This was it, the day he would step out of his old life and into the unknown. By mid-morning, the bank was running as usual. Customers came and went, transactions were processed, and the faint hum of the building's air conditioning filled the silence between conversations. Theodore moved through his tasks with practiced ease, his calm demeanor betraying none of the tension simmering beneath the surface. At exactly 11:10 a.m., Cheryl stepped away from her desk, muttering something about needing coffee. Theodore didn't watch her leave. He had already timed this moment perfectly. As she walked out, he reached for her keycard, sliding it into his pocket as smoothly as he had during the test run. He took a deep breath and made his way to the vault. His steps were steady, deliberate. Each second felt stretched, as if time itself was conspiring to make him reconsider. But Theodore's resolve was unshakable. He swiped the keycard and the light on the door's lock turned green. The vault door creaked open, revealing the neatly stacked bundles of cash inside. Theodore didn't hesitate. He moved with precision, stuffing the duffel bag with as much money as it could hold without appearing suspiciously heavy. He avoided the smaller bills, focusing only on the hundreds and fifties. His hands worked quickly, but his mind remained sharp, counting every second as it ticked by. By the time his watch read 11:18 a.m., the bag was full. He zipped it up, adjusted his tie, and stepped out of the vault, closing the door behind him. The hallway was empty, just as he had planned. Theodore walked back to his desk, the duffel bag slung casually over his shoulder. He didn't look around or hurry. Any sign of nervousness could draw attention. As he passed by Frank, he gave the guard a quick wave. "Heading out for lunch," he said, his tone light and conversational. "Don't eat too much or you'll fall asleep at your desk," Frank joked, not even glancing at the bag. Theodore chuckled, pushing the glass door open and stepping into the crisp afternoon air. The first wave of relief washed over him, but he knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. Theodore walked to his car, parked discreetly 2 blocks away. His movements remained measured, his pace steady. Once inside, he placed the duffel bag on the passenger seat and started the engine. The hum of the car was a comforting sound, a reminder that he was in control. He didn't drive directly to the storage locker. Instead, he took a meandering route through the city, blending in with the traffic. He stopped at a gas station, bought a bottle of water, and took a moment to steady himself. Everything had gone according to plan, but the weight of what he had done was beginning to sink in. When he finally reached the storage facility, he parked in the shadows and unloaded the bag. The locker was exactly as he had left it, plain and unassuming. He placed the money inside, securing the lock before stepping back and taking a deep breath. It was done. Theodore returned to the bank that afternoon, his demeanor as calm as ever. He sat at his desk, processed transactions, and greeted customers with his usual politeness. No one suspected a thing. To his co-workers, it was just another day. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere began to shift. Cheryl returned to her desk and immediately noticed something was off. "Why is my keycard on the floor?" she muttered, picking it up with a puzzled expression. Later that evening, during the routine vault check, Greg, the manager, discovered the discrepancy. The cash was missing, but the vault showed no signs of forced entry. Panic rippled through the staff as Greg called an emergency meeting, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "The vault's been compromised," he said, pacing the floor. "We're conducting a full investigation. No one leaves until we figure this out." Theodore sat quietly, his face a mask of concern. Inside, his heart raced, but he forced himself to stay composed. He had prepared for this moment, and he wouldn't let it break him. The morning sun illuminated Cleveland's streets, casting long shadows on the buildings as Theodore walked toward the bank. Each step felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of his plan already pressed down on him. He wore his usual gray suit, freshly pressed, his tie knotted perfectly. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, a rhythmic reminder to stay calm, to blend in. The briefcase in his hand, though outwardly ordinary, carried everything he needed: a set of forged documents, space for the cash, and the determination to change his life. Inside, Theodore rehearsed his plan one last time. There was no room for hesitation. As he entered the bank, he was greeted by familiar sights and sounds. Cheryl waved from the front desk, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the break room, and the hum of conversations created an almost soothing backdrop. "Morning, Theo," Cheryl called, her smile bright and carefree. "Morning," he replied, his voice steady. His expression betrayed nothing of the storm within. Theodore knew the bank's schedule as well as his own reflection. At 12:15 p.m., the lunch rush would reach its peak. Customers would shuffle in and out, clerks would be occupied with transactions, and the managers would be attending their routine meeting in the upstairs conference room. He timed his actions carefully. By noon, he excused himself for his lunch break, a briefcase in hand. No one noticed as he slipped past the desks toward the vault. The vault was the bank's heart, nestled behind a reinforced door that Theodore had opened countless times during his tenure. Today, however, felt different. The door wasn't just a barrier. It was the final step between him and the life he wanted. Inside the vault, the air felt cooler, heavier. The dim light from the overhead fixtures reflected off the steel walls, casting faint shadows. The rows of cash were arranged with meticulous precision, each bundle secured with bands stamped with the bank's insignia. Theodore's hands trembled slightly as he approached the shelves. He had planned this moment in his mind so many times, but the reality was overwhelming. He reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth texture of the money bands. He worked quickly, his movements deliberate and controlled. The first bundle went into the briefcase, followed by another and another. Each stack was $10,000, and he counted silently in his head as he filled the case. The total had to be exact. $215,000. Not a dollar more, not a dollar less. Anything excessive might draw immediate attention. His heart raced as he arranged the bundles, ensuring the case closed without issue. He wiped his palms against his trousers, forcing himself to breathe deeply. Every nerve in his body screamed to hurry, but he knew haste could lead to mistakes. Before leaving, Theodore adjusted the remaining stacks on the shelves, creating the illusion that nothing was missing. The faint scent of money lingered in the air as he double-checked his work. As he turned to leave, the vault door seemed to loom larger than before. This was the point of no return. He tightened his grip on the briefcase and stepped out into the corridor, his face a mask of calm. The corridor outside the vault was quiet, save for the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. Theodore walked with purpose, his steps measured, his gaze fixed ahead. He had rehearsed this moment so many times that it felt almost mechanical. As he neared the main floor, Cheryl's voice broke through the silence. "Heading out for lunch?" she asked, her tone cheerful. "Yeah," he replied, glancing back with a small smile. "I might take my time today." She laughed lightly, not noticing the faint tremor in his voice. "Enjoy." Theodore continued toward the door, the briefcase swinging lightly in his hand. Every instinct screamed to run, to bolt through the exit, but he forced himself to maintain his pace. Each step felt agonizingly slow, but he couldn't risk drawing attention. The door's glass reflected his image as he pushed it open, stepping into the summer heat. The warmth hit him like a wave, the bright sunlight momentarily disorienting him. He adjusted his grip on the briefcase and kept walking, blending into the sea of pedestrians. 3 blocks away, his car waited in an unmarked lot, hidden among dozens of others. Theodore's footsteps quickened slightly as he neared the vehicle. The sound of traffic and the chatter of passers-by filled the air, a chaotic symphony that contrasted sharply with the stillness inside the vault just minutes earlier. He unlocked the car with steady hands, placing the briefcase on the passenger seat. For a moment, he sat behind the wheel, staring at the case. The reality of what he had done began to sink in. He started the engine, the hum of the car providing a strange sense of comfort. As he pulled onto the road, his mind raced. The first phase of his plan was complete, but the real challenge was just beginning. He had to disappear without a trace, leaving behind the life he once knew. Theodore's hands gripped the wheel tightly as he navigated through the city, avoiding major intersections and high traffic areas. Each turn felt like a calculated move on a chessboard, every decision critical. Theodore's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the dimly lit outskirts of Cleveland. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the road did little to calm the storm in his mind. Each mile he covered felt like a step further away from the life he had known, but closer to the unknown. The weight of the briefcase sitting on the passenger seat was a constant reminder of the magnitude of his actions. His thoughts raced. Had anyone discovered the missing money yet? Were the police already on his trail? The anxiety churned in his gut, but he forced himself to breathe deeply and focus on the road ahead. The city skyline disappeared behind him as he merged onto the interstate, heading toward a small motel he had scouted weeks earlier. It was the first stop on his carefully mapped-out escape route. The plan had been rehearsed in his mind so many times that it felt like muscle memory. Traffic was sparse, the occasional headlights of passing cars slicing through the darkness. He kept his speed steady, avoiding anything that might draw attention. The radio was off. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and his own thoughts echoing loudly in his head. The motel was as unremarkable as Theodore had hoped. Its peeling paint and flickering vacancy sign ensured it would attract little attention from passers-by. He pulled into the lot, choosing a spot furthest from the office, where shadows from the broken streetlight provided some cover. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his jacket to conceal the briefcase as he made his way to the door. The room was as shabby as the exterior, yellowing wallpaper, a sagging bed, and the faint smell of mildew. Theodore locked the door behind him and placed the briefcase on the bed, staring at it for a moment as if to absorb the gravity of what it contained. He opened it, revealing the neatly bundled cash inside. The crisp bills seemed surreal, almost otherworldly under the flickering fluorescent light of the room. A thrill shot through him, quickly replaced by the weight of the responsibility he had just shouldered. In the dingy bathroom, he peeled off his gray suit and tie, replacing them with a pair of worn jeans, a hoodie, and a baseball cap. The suit went into a duffel bag along with his old ID, bank-issued key card, and anything else that could link him to Cleveland. Theodore studied himself in the cracked mirror. He looked different, ordinary, unrecognizable even to himself. This wasn't just a disguise. It was the first layer of the new identity he was about to assume. Before leaving the motel, Theodore made one last phone call to his parents. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the call button. When he finally pressed it, the sound of his mother's voice on the other end nearly broke his composure. "Hi, Mom," he said, keeping his voice light, though his throat felt tight. "I just wanted to let you know I'll be out of town for a while. Work stuff. Don't worry about me, okay?" She asked questions, where he was going, when he'd be back, but Theodore kept his answers vague. "I'll call when I can," he promised, knowing it was likely a lie. He hung up before the conversation could go any deeper. The drive to the next phase of his plan felt heavier after the call. He knew this might be the last time he'd hear his mother's voice, the last time he'd feel tethered to the life he was leaving behind. Theodore's car was his lifeline, but it was also a liability. He drove it to a bustling shopping center on the edge of a neighboring town, blending in with the sea of vehicles in the crowded parking lot. Under the cover of the afternoon bustle, he removed the license plates and wiped down every surface he had touched. The duffel bag slung over his shoulder felt like an anchor as he walked away, blending into the crowd without a second glance. For a moment, he paused near the entrance of a large department store, turning back to look at the car one last time. It had been his constant companion, but now it was just another loose end he had to let go of. At the nearby bus terminal, Theodore purchased a ticket to Denver using the name on his new identification, Thomas Randell. The photo on the ID was barely recognizable, the man in it looking far more confident than he felt at the moment. The bus ride was long, stretching across days as it wound through highways and small towns. Theodore kept to himself, sitting near the back and pretending to sleep most of the time. His duffel bag never left his side, the thought of its contents keeping him on edge. By the time the bus pulled into Denver, Theodore had rehearsed his new identity 100 times in his mind. Thomas Randell was a quiet accountant looking for a fresh start. He had no ties to Cleveland, no past worth mentioning. He found a small, run-down apartment on the edge of the city, paying the first month's rent in cash. The landlord didn't ask questions, just handed him the keys and a warning about the unreliable plumbing. Thomas Randell's life in Denver was a far cry from the one Theodore Conrad had left behind. Days blurred together as he maintained a low profile, taking on odd jobs and carefully investing the stolen money to create a modest but sustainable life. The thrill of the heist had long faded, replaced by a constant undercurrent of paranoia. Theodore avoided crowded places, never stayed in one location for too long, and kept his interactions with others to a minimum. Despite the isolation, there were moments of unexpected contentment. He found solace in the quiet routines of his new life, the simplicity of cooking his own meals, the anonymity of walking through the city without being recognized. But even as years turned into decades, Theodore couldn't escape the weight of his secret. Every time he heard a siren, every time a stranger lingered too long in his periphery, his heart raced. The stolen money had given him freedom, but it had also made him a prisoner of his own choices. By the time Theodore, now Thomas, reached his 70s, his past felt like a distant memory. He had built a life in Denver, complete with a wife and daughter who knew nothing of the man he once was. But the truth caught up with him in 2021. On his deathbed, surrounded by family, Theodore reflected on the choices that had defined his life. The heist, the escape, the years spent looking over his shoulder. It had all shaped him, for better or worse. When investigators uncovered his true identity after his death, the revelation sent shockwaves through the small community he had called home. To those who knew him, Thomas Randell had been an unassuming, kind man. The truth of his past only deepened the mystery of who he really was. Theodore Conrad had vanished, but Thomas Randell had lived. In the end, the two men became one, a thief, a fugitive, and a man searching for freedom in a life defined by escape.